I didn't notice him cheating. I wasn't suspicious. That's why it took me so long to understand what was happening. He was still there, still saying, "I love you." But when something mattered, I wasn't the person he chose anymore. That was the moment everything changed. I'm a woman who always believed loyalty wasn't just about faithfulness. It was about priority. I was in a long-term relationship that looked stable to everyone else. Shared routines, shared plans, a life that felt secure. I wasn't looking for proof of betrayal. I wasn't trying to catch him doing something wrong. But when I realized he was emotionally choosing someone else over me, quietly, consistently, I had to face a question that still divides people. Can a relationship survive when you're no longer the person your partner chooses first? Do you believe someone can betray you without ever cheating? Share your opinion in the comments, subscribe, and share this story with someone who might relate. At first, I didn't have a reason to doubt anything. He didn't change his routine. He didn't hide his phone. He didn't act distant in a way that would raise alarms. That's what made it so confusing. We still lived together, still talked about bills, work, weekends, still made plans that sounded normal and safe. From the outside, our relationship looked exactly the same. But slowly, I began to feel like I was arriving late to conversations I used to be part of. He'd say things like, "I already figured that out," or, "I talked it through and it makes sense now." At first, I thought he meant with himself. Then I realized he didn't. I noticed how calm he was about things that used to stress him out. How certain he sounded about decisions we hadn't discussed yet. How he seemed emotionally settled before we ever talked. It felt like someone else had already helped him reach clarity. And I was just being informed. I tried to ignore the feeling. I told myself this was maturity. That adults don't need to process everything together. That independence is healthy. I didn't want to be insecure. I didn't want to become suspicious over nothing. But then there were the small moments that added up. When something funny happened during his day, he'd smile at his phone first. When something stressful came up, he'd say, "It's fine now," without explaining why. When I asked questions, he answered, but briefly, like the conversation was already finished somewhere else. I started feeling like a summary instead of a partner. One night, while we were sitting together in silence, I asked him casually, "Who do you usually talk to when you're overwhelmed?" He paused. Not long, but long enough. Then he said, "I don't know. I guess whoever's around." That answer didn't sit right with me, because I was right there. I had always been right there. And yet, for the first time, I felt like availability wasn't the same as being chosen. That was the moment the thought crossed my mind, quietly, almost apologetically. What if he wasn't cheating? What if he had simply stopped choosing me? Do you think this is still normal behavior in a relationship? Or is this already a warning sign? After that night, I started paying attention in a way I hadn't before. Not because I wanted to accuse him, not because I was looking for proof, but because my intuition stopped letting me rest. I began noticing how often he seemed emotionally ahead of our conversations. Like he had already processed things before I even knew they existed. He would come home calm after days that should have been stressful, confident about decisions that usually took us hours to talk through, certain in a way that felt outsourced. I asked myself if I was imagining it. Maybe I was just sensitive. Maybe this was what emotional maturity looked like. Maybe I was expecting too much closeness. I reminded myself that healthy relationships allow space, that partners don't have to be each other's only support. But then I asked the question I kept avoiding. If space is healthy, why did it feel like distance? I noticed how his phone had become a source of reassurance for him, not in a secretive way, in a comfortable way. He'd check it when he was overwhelmed. Smile softly. Take a breath. And then come talk to me, already regulated. It made me feel like I was no longer part of the emotional process, just the final audience. I tried to reconnect without making it a problem. I shared more about my day, asked open-ended questions, created space for deeper conversations, but the responses stayed shallow, polite, appropriate, finished. I started feeling like I was interrupting something invisible. One evening, I told him about something that had been weighing on me. I expected empathy, maybe curiosity. Instead, he nodded and said, "You know, you're probably overthinking this." The certainty in his voice caught me off guard. It didn't sound like his conclusion. It sounded like something that had already been discussed and agreed upon elsewhere. I asked him, "Have you talked to someone about this?" He didn't deny it. He said, "Yeah, it helped me get perspective." Perspective. That word stayed with me all night, because perspective requires distance, and I hadn't realized he had stepped that far away from us. Lying next to him later, I felt an ache I couldn't explain. He was right there, his arm close to mine, his breathing familiar. But emotionally, I felt alone. And for the first time, I wasn't afraid of him leaving me for someone else. I was afraid that he had already left, quietly, emotionally, and I was the last one to notice. At this point, would you trust your intuition, or would you still tell yourself you're overreacting? I didn't confront him right away, not because I was afraid of the truth, but because I needed to understand what I was feeling before turning it into words. I started replaying recent weeks in my head, slowly, like rewinding a movie and noticing details I had missed the first time. Moments that felt insignificant on their own, but heavy when placed together. I noticed how he stopped asking for my opinion on things that used to matter to him, career decisions, personal doubts, even small frustrations. He would tell me what he decided, not ask what I thought. At first, I told myself this was confidence, growth, someone who knew himself better. But confidence doesn't exclude the person you love. I also noticed how his tone changed when he talked about someone at work or a friend. Nothing romantic, nothing obvious, just softer, more engaged. I'd catch it in the way his voice relaxed, in how present he suddenly became when explaining something they had talked about. Meanwhile, when it was just us, conversations felt rushed. Like emotional depth had a time limit, I started feeling like I had to earn his attention again, like I was competing with something I couldn't see. One night, I asked him something simple. "Do you feel like you can talk to me the same way you used to?" He looked genuinely confused. "I talk to you all the time," he said, and that's when it hit me. We were using the same words to describe completely different experiences. Talking isn't the same as sharing. Being present isn't the same as being chosen. I tried explaining that I missed feeling emotionally included, that I missed being part of his internal process. He listened. He nodded. Then he said something that stayed with me for days. "I don't want to dump everything on you. I know how much you care." I didn't know how to respond to that, because caring was suddenly framed as a limitation, as something that disqualified me from closeness. That night, I realized something painful. I hadn't become less important to him. I had become more complicated. And instead of leaning into that complexity, he had chosen simplicity elsewhere. I went to bed feeling invisible in a way I had never felt before. Not unloved, not unwanted, just unnecessary. And once that feeling settles in, it's impossible to ignore. Do you think emotional closeness should get easier over time? Or is it normal for people to look elsewhere when things feel complicated? Once I accepted that something was wrong, I stopped trying to explain it away. That's when the pattern became impossible to ignore. It wasn't just that he talked to someone else. It was when he did. I noticed he reached for his phone whenever something unsettled him. Not after we talked, not while we talked. Before. If something stressful happened at work, I could feel it in the air, the tension, the distraction. But instead of turning to me, he'd disappear into short messages, a few minutes, sometimes less. And when he came back, he was calm, centered, as if the storm had already passed somewhere else. I asked him one evening, trying to keep my voice neutral, "Who do you usually talk to when you feel like that?" He hesitated, just slightly. Then he answered honestly. "A friend," he said. "She helps me think things through." That was the first time he used she, instead of something vague. I didn't react right away. I didn't accuse him of anything. I asked, "How long has that been happening?" He shrugged. "A while. It's not a big deal." But it was a big deal. Not because she was a woman, not because I felt threatened by her, but because he spoke about her the way he used to speak about me. With ease, with trust, with openness. I asked what they talked about. He said life, stress, decisions, all the things that used to belong to us. I asked if she knew about me. He said yes, that she respected our relationship, that nothing inappropriate was happening. And I believed him. That was the part that hurt the most, because there was no villain I could point to, no obvious betrayal to justify my pain. Just a slow, deliberate shift of emotional intimacy away from me. That night, I sat alone replaying everything. I realized you don't accidentally become someone's emotional anchor. That role is built over time, conversation by conversation, choice by choice. And somewhere along the way, he had chosen her, not once, but repeatedly. I went to bed knowing something irreversible had already happened, not because he crossed a clear line, but because he gave away a place that used to be mine. Do you think emotional priority should be exclusive in a relationship? Or am I expecting too much? After that night, I stopped pretending I was okay, not out loud, not in ways anyone else could notice. But internally, something shifted. I started questioning myself in ways I never had before. I stood in front of the mirror longer than usual, not to admire myself, but to inspect. Had I changed that much? Was I less interesting now? Less emotionally safe? I replayed old memories in my head, conversations where he leaned into me, moments where my opinion mattered, times when I was the first person he called. And the contrast hurt. I noticed how his emotional distance began shaping my behavior. I hesitated before sharing things that excited me. I filtered my frustrations, afraid of sounding heavy or demanding. I caught myself choosing silence over honesty, not because I wanted to, but because it felt safer. That realization scared me. I wasn't just losing emotional priority. I was slowly losing myself. And the worst part was how invisible it all was. He wasn't cruel. He wasn't dismissive. He still held my hand, still asked how my day was. But intimacy without emotional presence feels hollow. I began asking myself questions I didn't want to answer. Why was I shrinking to fit into a space I used to fill naturally? Why was I trying to stay lovable instead of feeling loved? One afternoon, I typed a long message to him. Something honest, vulnerable, real. I reread it 3 times. Then I deleted it. Not because it wasn't true, but because I knew he would already process it somewhere else. That's when it hit me. I was managing my emotions to make room for a connection that wasn't ours. And that wasn't compromise. That was erasure. For the first time, I didn't just feel hurt. I felt disrespected, quietly, deeply, and I understood something that changed everything. If staying meant constantly editing myself to remain chosen, then staying wasn't love. It was self-betrayal. Have you ever caught yourself changing who you are just to keep someone emotionally close? The more I became aware of what was happening, the harder it was to pretend nothing had changed. I didn't explode. I didn't accuse. I didn't demand explanations. What I did instead was start paying attention to myself, to how often I felt tense around him, to how many conversations I rehearsed in my head before speaking, to how frequently I chose silence because it felt less risky than honesty. I noticed how comfortable he had become with my flexibility. When I didn't push, he didn't clarify. When I didn't question, he didn't volunteer information. My quiet had turned into permission. One evening, after another conversation that felt emotionally empty, I finally asked him something directly. "Do you feel closer to her than to me?" I asked calmly. No raised voice, no accusations. He didn't answer right away. That pause felt endless. Then he said he didn't see it like that things were just easier with her, that there was less pressure, less expectation. I asked him if that ease came from the fact that she didn't share a life with him, that she didn't rely on him, that she couldn't be disappointed by him. He didn't deny it. That was the moment something settled inside me. He wasn't choosing her because she was better than me. He was choosing her because the connection required less responsibility. And somehow, I had become the difficult one, simply for wanting emotional depth. I told him I felt replaced. Not physically, emotionally. He said that wasn't fair, that nothing inappropriate had happened, that I was reading too much into it. But fairness isn't measured by rules broken, it's measured by impact. And the impact was undeniable. I wasn't part of his emotional process anymore. I was the person he updated afterward. That night, lying next to him, I felt a loneliness I couldn't explain. He was right there, close enough to touch. But emotionally, he felt unreachable, and for the first time, I didn't wonder if I could lose him. I wondered what staying was costing me. Do you think emotional ease with someone else justifies this kind of distance in a relationship? After that conversation, I didn't feel relief. I felt exposed, not because I had said too much, but because I had finally said something he couldn't misunderstand. Things between us shifted into an uncomfortable quiet. Not hostile, not dramatic, careful. He started choosing his words more slowly, watching my reactions, asking if I was okay in a way that felt more like damage control than concern. And I hated that. I didn't want to be managed. I didn't want to be handled gently. I wanted to be chosen, kinda without conditions. What hurt the most was realizing that my honesty hadn't changed his behavior. It had only made him more discreet. He still talked to her. Maybe less openly, maybe more carefully. But the emotional connection didn't disappear. That's when a new fear settled in. What if confrontation doesn't fix emotional replacement? What if it only teaches people how to hide it better? I started imagining my future if nothing changed. Me constantly explaining why I needed closeness. Me negotiating emotional access. Me waiting for reassurance that should have been automatic. I also imagined the alternative. Stepping back. Letting silence do what words hadn't. Allowing distance to reveal what effort was no longer being made. Neither option felt safe. Staying felt like slowly bargaining away my dignity. Leaving felt like giving up without proof people would accept. I could already hear the judgment. He didn't cheat. You're overreacting. You're throwing something away. But I also knew something deeper. If love requires you to keep proving you deserve emotional priority, then love has already shifted into something else. One night, while he was asleep, I sat alone in the living room. No phone, no distractions. Just me and the question I couldn't avoid anymore. Am I staying because this relationship is right, or because I'm afraid of being alone? That question changed everything, because once you ask it honestly, you can't unask it. At this stage, would you distance yourself to protect your dignity, or keep fighting for emotional priority? I didn't announce a decision. I didn't threaten to leave. I didn't ask for reassurance. What I did instead was stop trying to hold everything together by myself. I stopped filling the silences, stopped smoothing over awkward moments, stopped pretending I wasn't hurt just to keep things calm. It wasn't a strategy. It was exhaustion. I let conversations end where they naturally ended. I let his distance remain visible instead of compensating for it. And something interesting happened. Without my effort, the imbalance became obvious. He started noticing the quiet, asking if something was wrong, saying things felt off. I told him the truth. I'm just not trying to make this feel okay anymore. He didn't like that answer. He said I was changing, that I was pulling away, that I was being unfair. And for the first time, I didn't rush to reassure him. I asked him a simple question. Why does it only feel like a problem now that I've stopped adjusting? He didn't have an answer. He said he felt like he was losing me. That sentence hit me harder than anything else he'd said, because I realized something painful. He noticed my absence more than he noticed my pain. I asked him if he had felt that same fear when he was emotionally leaning on someone else. He said he hadn't thought about it that way. That honesty mattered. But it came too late. I wasn't angry. I wasn't dramatic. I was clear. I told him I didn't want to compete for emotional space, that I didn't want to remind someone to choose me, that I didn't want to feel optional in my own relationship. He said he needed time to think. And for the first time, I didn't wait anxiously for his answer, because something had already shifted inside me. I realized that even if he chose me now, it would be because I pulled away, not because I was valued all along. And that kind of choice didn't feel like love. It felt like fear of loss. That night, I slept more peacefully than I had in weeks. Not because things were resolved, but because I had finally stopped abandoning myself to stay connected. And deep down, I knew the next step wouldn't be about convincing him of anything. It would be about honoring what I already knew. Do you think stepping back is a healthy way to reveal the truth, or does it just speed up the end? The clarity didn't arrive as relief. It arrived as certainty, not loud, not dramatic, just undeniable. Once I stopped trying to hold the relationship together on my own, I could finally see it for what it was, without filters, without hope doing the work for him. He started trying harder, not emotionally, but strategically. He asked how my day was more often, checked in more, made small gestures that looked like effort on the surface. But something about it felt off, because it wasn't instinctive. It was reactive. I realized he was responding to the possibility of losing me, not to the reality of having emotionally lost me months ago. I asked myself a question that hurt more than any argument. If I had stayed quiet and accommodating, would any of this effort exist? The answer was clear. I also noticed how careful he became when mentioning her. Less detail, more caution, not because the connection was gone, but because it had become inconvenient. That distinction mattered. One evening, I told him I needed space, not as a threat, not as a test, as a boundary. He asked if I was leaving him. I told him I didn't know yet. What I did know was that I couldn't keep explaining why emotional priority mattered to me. I couldn't keep asking to be chosen in ways that should be automatic. He said relationships require compromise, that no connection is perfect, that walking away would haunt me. He wasn't wrong, but staying would haunt me too. That night, I packed a small bag, nothing dramatic, just enough to think clearly. As I stood at the door, he asked one last question. Is this really worth losing everything? I paused, because the truth was, I wasn't afraid of losing everything. I was afraid of losing myself, and calling it love. And once I admitted that, there was only one honest direction left. At this point, do you think asking for space was a fair boundary, or was it already a decision in disguise? Leaving didn't feel like freedom at first. It felt like grief. Not just for him, but for the version of the relationship I kept hoping would come back. The days apart gave me something I hadn't had in months. Silence without tension. No waiting to see if I was chosen. No wondering who he talked to first. No shrinking myself to fit into a space that no longer expanded for me. When we met again, I wasn't angry. I wasn't begging. I wasn't trying to convince him of anything. I told him the truth. I don't feel emotionally safe with you anymore. He said he never meant to replace me, that it wasn't intentional, that he didn't see it happening until it was already there. And I believed him. But intention doesn't undo impact. I told him something I had finally learned to say without guilt. I don't want to be loved conditionally. I don't want to be chosen only when I pull away. And I don't want to compete for a place that used to be mine. He asked if there was anything he could do to fix it. I paused, because months earlier, that question would have given me hope. Now it just felt late. I told him I needed a relationship where emotional closeness wasn't negotiated, where I didn't have to explain why being the first choice mattered. Walking away wasn't easy. People questioned it. Some minimized it. He didn't cheat. Nothing really happened. But something did happen. I lost my place slowly, and I refused to keep pretending that didn't count. I learned that betrayal doesn't always look like another person in your bed. Sometimes it looks like realizing you're no longer the person your partner turns to when life gets heavy. And choosing myself wasn't a punishment. It was an act of self-respect. I didn't leave because he chose someone else. I left because he stopped choosing me. And I finally chose myself. Do you think I made the right choice in the end? If you enjoy real, thought-provoking Reddit-style stories told from a female perspective, subscribe to the channel for more.